Hi, welcome. My name is Monica, and I want you to consider the possibility of election fraud. Be aware of the fraud triangle. When does fraud occur? It occurs when there's pressure, when there's an opportunity, and when there's a rationalization. Pressure, meaning an organization or group wants to perform and look good. Second, opportunity. The process is not sufficiently monitored, so people can commit fraud. Third, rationalization. There's an excuse available for not being ethical. As we consider the possibility of fraud, we should really focus on solutions. So I propose 5 ways to prevent election fraud. First, authentication of voters. Second, use statistical analysis and auditing tools. Third, Citizens Election Fraud Reporting website. Fourth, prosecute anyone involved in election fraud to the full extent of the law. Fifth, create an action plan to prevent and detect fraud. Okay, so let's start with authentication of voters. We need to identify the voters using at least 2 forms of ID. Hey, when you go to the bank, do they just give you money? Or do you have to present an ID or authenticate yourself? Don't you think voting is important and voters should be identified? So let's start with each case. Case 1, voting by mail. Well, if they're voting by mail, voters submitting ballots need to present 2 forms of ID. It's important, right? So you need to know who's voting. Do they have a right to vote? How many votes are they submitting? Are they submitting their vote? Many questions to be asked here. Case 2. If they were voting electronically, then use electronic authentication methods similar to those used to access credit report and/or some sort of multi-factor authentication. Third, voting in person. You need to verify a current ID and perhaps a second ID. Fourth, drop-off voting. I'm pretty suspicious of this. Who knows how many ballots the person's turning in, who's turning in, and how those ballots were obtained and submitted. I wouldn't use drop-off voting unless there's an authentication procedure in place. Next, detection of fraud using auditing and statistical techniques. Use internal controls. Consider how fraud could be done. Brainstorm vulnerabilities. When could that fraud have occurred? Check the numbers using statistical analysis tools. Are there any unusual patterns? Could you possibly compare census data to voting data? Do the numbers make sense? And of course, voting samples. Just like in statistics, when you're trying to detect fraud in a company for financial fraud, for example, you use samples. Why not test voting samples to see if that's being done? I also suggest Citizens Election Fraud Reporting website. Create a website where U.S. citizens can report election fraud. They should say the type of fraud, the persons involved, and the evidence for the fraud. There are similar websites in place already for other types of crime. For example, there's the Internal Crime Complaint Center, except that instead of complaining about crimes, we should focus on election fraud. Prosecution of fraud. I believe it would be a terrible and horrible crime to commit fraud in elections, and we should consider the severe consequences of fraud on fraud election on a democracy. If someone is caught and the evidence is there, prosecute those involved in election fraud to the full extent of the law. Lastly, use an action plan to prevent fraud. That is, you need to come up with contingency plans. Does it work? Yes. Implement. It doesn't work. What's your backup plan? Use of risk analysis techniques to identify and address voting vulnerabilities. You could use flowcharts to analyze each of the voting cases to identify ways to correct vulnerabilities. And lastly, one could think of implementing continuous quality improvement methods for elections. So here's the big question. Why consider election fraud? Okay, well, it has taken place in many countries. 2, there were pressures, opportunities, and excuses for fraud. And lastly, if we do not ensure a systematic, fraud-proof election policies, procedures, and protections, then we risk the loss of our democracy and our nation. Thank you for listening.